It was late at night in the small, quiet town of Riverton. The only sound was the occasional hum of streetlights and the chirp of crickets in the distance. Lucas Arnett, a mechanic who ran his own shop, was finishing up his last repairs for the day. He had always liked working alone, and the solitude of his small garage suited him just fine. His hands were dirty from fixing a broken engine, but it didn't bother him. He loved the smell of oil and grease, the feeling of his tools in his hands. The clock on the wall showed 11:45 p.m. when a loud, thunderous crash broke the peaceful night. Lucas jumped, his heart racing as the sound echoed through the streets. The noise was too close, far too close. He quickly wiped his hands on a rag, grabbed his flashlight, and rushed outside. As soon as he stepped out of the garage, the night air hit him like a cold slap. He shivered slightly but kept moving toward the source of the crash. It had come from the woods on the edge of town, where the trees stood tall and dark against the sky. He could barely see anything in the thick darkness, but he knew the sound had been loud enough to be something serious. Taking a deep breath, Lucas started running toward the woods. His boots crunched against the gravel as he moved quickly. The flashlight in his hand cut through the night, and he tried to stay focused. What could have caused that sound? Was it a plane? A meteor? A prank? He didn't know, but he had to check. After a few minutes of running, Lucas reached the woods. He slowed down, trying to be quiet. His breath came in quick bursts, and he could feel his heartbeat in his chest. Something was definitely out of place. The trees were unusually quiet, the usual sounds of animals absent. Then, just ahead, he saw it. A massive object lay in the clearing. It looked like a ship of some kind, its surface covered in strange markings that Lucas couldn't understand. The craft was half buried in the earth, its metal smoking and hot. He felt a rush of adrenaline. Was it a crash landing? Had something from the sky really come down? He stepped closer, his flashlight flickering as he approached the wreckage. The ship was unlike anything he had ever seen. It had smooth curves, glowing edges, and markings that looked alien to him. But what struck him most was the sense of strange power emanating from it. He could feel it in the air, a hum that vibrated against his chest. Lucas's curiosity pushed him forward. He moved carefully around the wreckage, trying to avoid stepping on anything sharp or dangerous. As he got closer to the front of the ship, he heard something, a faint sound, almost like a groan. Turning sharply, Lucas spotted movement. In the debris near the ship's edge, something, or someone, was barely visible. It was a figure, lying on the ground, curled up in a fetal position. Panic surged through him. Could someone be hurt? Without thinking, he dropped to his knees beside the figure. The person, no, it wasn't human, was a woman. Her skin was pale, almost glowing in the moonlight, and her long hair was dark and tangled. She was unconscious, her chest rising and falling in shallow breaths. Her clothes were torn, and her limbs were covered in bruises and burns. She looked like she had been through hell. For a moment, Lucas just stared at her, unsure of what to do. She was unlike anything he had ever seen, and his mind struggled to make sense of the situation. Was she an alien? A survivor from another planet? His heart pounded as he realized how strange this all was, but something about her made him feel protective, like he couldn't leave her there, alone and hurt. He gently reached out, touching her arm. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked softly. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke, but he had to make sure she was okay. The woman groaned, her eyelids fluttering. Slowly, she opened her eyes, revealing irises that shimmered with a pale, almost silver hue. Her gaze met Lucas's, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, in a weak, trembling voice, she spoke in a language Lucas didn't understand. It was soft, melodic, but completely foreign. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what she was saying, but the fear in her voice was clear. She was terrified, and it was only then that he realized just how dangerous her situation must have been. She tried to sit up, but a sharp wince passed over her face, and she collapsed back onto the ground. Lucas's heart went out to her. Despite her alien appearance, she seemed just as vulnerable as anyone else. He couldn't leave her here alone. "I'll help you," he said, more to himself than to her. He gently lifted her in his arms, careful not to hurt her. She was surprisingly light, almost delicate despite her visible injuries. Her body was warm, and the soft glow from her skin made her seem almost otherworldly. He started to walk back toward his garage, his mind racing. What had happened to her? Why was she here? And most importantly, who, or what, was after her? As he carried her back to his shop, he could hear distant sounds, faint noises in the distance, like the hum of something large. Was she being pursued? Was that why she was so desperate? Lucas didn't know the answers to any of these questions, but one thing was certain: his life had just been changed forever, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. Lucas's small garage was silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the soft buzz of the overhead lights. He carefully placed the alien woman on a workbench, her head resting on a clean towel he'd thrown down. Her breathing was still shallow, but at least she seemed to be stable now. Lucas had washed the dirt and blood from her face as best as he could, and she was no longer unconscious, though her eyes remained closed. He stood by, unsure of what to do next. His mind raced. She was unlike anyone or anything he had ever seen, and it was difficult to even begin processing the situation. He had been alone most of his life, a quiet, reserved guy who liked fixing cars and staying out of trouble. But now, here he was, with an alien woman in his shop, a mysterious ship in the woods, and a growing sense of fear settling in his chest. What am I supposed to do now? Lucas muttered to himself, pacing back and forth. He had no answers. There were so many questions, and so little time. He glanced at the woman, who was starting to stir. Her long, dark hair framed her face, and as her eyes fluttered open, she slowly looked around the room, taking in the strange surroundings. Her silver-gray eyes locked with his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. There was a strange connection between them, something silent but understood. She had been through so much, and yet there was a quiet strength in her gaze. "Are you okay?" Lucas asked, his voice gentle, unsure of how to communicate. She blinked at him, but didn't respond, and he realized that the language barrier was going to be a bigger problem than he had anticipated. The woman opened her mouth to speak, but the words were completely foreign. They were soft and melodic, but they didn't make any sense to Lucas. He frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to process what was happening. He didn't know if she could understand him, or if he was even saying the right things. I don't know what you're saying," Lucas said, feeling frustrated. "Can you understand me?" he asked, his voice growing a little louder. The woman looked at him, and Lucas saw her expression change. There was confusion in her eyes. She tried to sit up, but then winced, her body still weak from the crash. She placed a hand to her chest, looking as if the effort to speak was physically painful. "No, I can't," she whispered, her voice strained. But the words were still in her language, and Lucas could hardly make them out. Lucas took a deep breath. He needed to think. He looked around the shop, searching for something that could help. There were books scattered on the workbench, some old manuals, and parts catalogs for engines, but none of it was going to help him communicate with this woman. She tried again, speaking in her language. Her voice was weak, but carried a sense of urgency. Lucas could tell she was asking for something, but he had no idea what. "I don't understand," Lucas said softly, his words trailing off. He felt helpless. What was he supposed to do? He couldn't let her down, but they couldn't even communicate. The alien woman stared at him for a long moment before trying again, this time a little more clearly. The words were still unfamiliar, but there was a tone of desperation in her voice. Lucas couldn't tell if she was pleading for help or explaining her situation, but he knew one thing: whatever she needed, she was in trouble. He took a step closer, unsure of what else to do. "You're safe here," he said, his voice trying to sound reassuring. "You don't have to be afraid. I'll help you." Her eyes widened slightly as if she understood his words but couldn't respond in a way that made sense to him. She took a few shallow breaths before slowly sitting up again, though she still seemed weak. With trembling hands, she reached into a small pouch at her side and pulled out a small device that looked like a tiny communicator. She held it in her hand for a moment, as if gathering strength, and then she pressed a button. A soft, electronic voice echoed from the device. It was clear and mechanical, but the words sounded more like a translation. "Help, please," the voice said, sounding strained. It was in English. "What can I do?" he asked, feeling helpless. "I'm just a mechanic. I don't know anything about fighting aliens." Erindra turned to him, her eyes locking onto his with an intensity he hadn't seen before. "You are more capable than you think," she said quietly. "Your species. You are resourceful. You think in ways the Veracor do not. They underestimate you. That is your strength." Lucas wasn't sure what she meant, but he could see the truth in her words. He had always been good at solving problems, whether it was fixing a car or figuring out how to get a stubborn engine to run. Maybe those skills could help them now, in a way he never imagined. "I'll do what I can," Lucas said, more determined than ever. He wasn't going to let her down. Over the next hour, they worked together. Lucas quickly gathered tools from his shop, trying to think of ways to protect themselves. He used scraps of metal and old parts to build makeshift defenses. Nothing high-tech, but it was something. Erindra helped where she could, though she was clearly still weakened from her ordeal. She taught him a few basic tricks from her species, ways to hide their presence and confuse any enemy trackers. Lucas felt an odd sense of purpose as they worked. It was strange to think that a few hours ago, his biggest worry had been finishing a car repair. Now he was preparing for a fight with an alien race that could wipe out entire planets. When the first sounds of a distant hum reached his ears, his heart skipped a beat. Erindra heard it too, her expression shifting to one of quiet alarm. "They were here. They are coming," Erindra said in a whisper. "They have found us." Lucas's mind raced. They didn't have much time. He grabbed a few more tools, some supplies, and motioned for Erindra to follow him. They needed to move fast, and they needed to stay ahead of the Veracor. As they hurried toward the back door, the sound of engines grew louder, and Lucas could feel the weight of the situation settling in his chest. This wasn't just some bad dream. This was real. The Veracor were coming, and there was no turning back. The sound of the distant engines grew louder with every passing second. Lucas's heart raced, and his palms grew sweaty as he motioned for Erindra to follow him. They had to move quickly, but carefully. The Veracor were getting closer. Every minute counted. "Where do we go?" Lucas asked, trying to keep his voice steady. He was doing his best not to panic, but the reality of the situation was hard to ignore. They were being hunted, and he was just a mechanic. He wasn't equipped for something like this. Erindra didn't hesitate. She moved with a purpose, her movements graceful despite her injuries. "We need to get to higher ground," she said, her voice low and urgent. "The Veracor use tracking technology. We can't stay hidden down here for long." Lucas nodded, understanding what she meant. They couldn't stay in the garage any longer. They had to leave and find a better hiding spot, somewhere the enemy wouldn't be able to track them as easily. He grabbed a few things, tools, a flashlight, anything he might need, and then they were off. They moved quickly through the woods behind his garage, the sound of the Veracor's ships growing louder. Lucas's thoughts raced. The aliens had technology far beyond anything he had ever seen. Could they really track them through the trees? Could they hear every step they took? "Don't make noise," Erindra whispered, her voice sharp. She led the way, gliding through the trees like a shadow. Lucas followed close behind, trying to mimic her movements as best as he could. They moved silently, their footsteps barely making a sound on the soft earth beneath them. For a few minutes, the only sounds were the distant hum of the ships and the rustle of the wind through the trees. Lucas tried to focus on staying calm, but his mind kept racing. How had this happened? How had his quiet, peaceful life turned into a fight for survival against alien hunters? They reached a small hill, and Erindra paused for a moment, scanning the area. Lucas tried to steady his breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The night sky above was dark, but there was a faint glow on the horizon. The first signs of dawn were starting to break through the trees. Up there, Erindra said, pointing to a rock outcrop higher up on the hill. It's a good spot. We can hide there and watch for their approach. Without wasting any time, they began to climb. The ground was rocky, but Erindra's agility made it look effortless. Lucas struggled a bit more, but he kept moving. They needed to get to the top before the Vercor arrived. They couldn't afford to be caught off guard. Lucas stared at the device, his eyes wide with surprise. It was a translation device. His mind raced as he processed this new information. So she could understand him, but couldn't speak his language directly. The woman looked at him, her eyes filled with hope. "Are you asking for help?" Lucas asked cautiously, his voice quiet. The woman nodded slowly, her silver-gray eyes never leaving his face. She spoke again, though the words were still foreign, and the translator device relayed her message. "Chased, hunted, need protection," the voice said. Lucas swallowed hard. This was more serious than he had imagined. The words were clear, and the fear in her voice was impossible to ignore. She wasn't just stranded here. She was running from something, someone, and she needed help. But who was chasing her? And why had she come to Earth? "I'll protect you," Lucas promised, even though he didn't fully understand the danger. He had no idea what he was getting into, but seeing her so vulnerable, so clearly in need, something inside him clicked. He couldn't turn his back on her. The woman's eyes softened at his words, and for the first time, she gave a small, relieved smile. It was weak, but it was there, and Lucas felt a rush of emotion. Determination and fear, but also something else he couldn't quite name. They were connected now, whether they liked it or not. They were in this together. And as much as Lucas wished for the world to make sense again, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't going to let her face whatever hunted her alone. Lucas paced around his small garage, trying to make sense of everything that had happened over the past few hours. His mind was still spinning from the strange turn his life had taken. He had gone from fixing cars to sheltering an alien fugitive, someone who had come from the stars, someone who was being hunted by beings far more powerful than anything he could imagine. The alien woman, Erindra, had explained a little more through her translator device, though it wasn't much. She was being chased by an enemy race, a ruthless group called the Vercor, who had been hunting her across the galaxy. Erindra was a defector, someone who had rebelled against them, and now she was paying the price. "They will not stop," she had told him in broken English, her voice full of fear and determination. "They will come for me, and they will not stop until I am gone." Lucas didn't know what to make of it all. The idea of an alien race coming after them seemed impossible, but looking at Erindra, her shimmering, almost otherworldly beauty, he couldn't deny that she was telling the truth. The Vercor were real, and they were coming for her. His thoughts were interrupted when Erindra stirred in the corner of the shop. She had insisted on standing despite her injuries, though her movements were slow and cautious. Her eyes scanned the small room, constantly looking toward the windows, as if she expected danger to burst through at any moment. Lucas could see the tension in her body. She was always on alert, always waiting for the next threat to appear. "Are you sure you're okay?" Lucas asked, walking over to her. He had done his best to treat her injuries, but she still looked pale, her strength clearly drained from the crash and the trauma she had experienced. "I am fine," she said, though her voice wavered. "But we must leave. They are close. They can find me. They can track me." Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. The idea that they were being hunted by an advanced alien race was terrifying, but Irindra's words made it even worse. The Verkor were relentless. He could sense the fear in her, but there was something else too: determination. Irindra wouldn't let herself be caught. She wasn't just running. She was fighting to survive. He glanced out the window, looking out over the woods. It had been hours since the crash, and the night had grown quiet again. Too quiet. He knew the Verkor were out there, somewhere, searching for her. But what did they want with her? Was she some sort of prisoner or something more? "We need a plan," Lucas said, more to himself than to Irindra. His mind was racing. He had no military training, no experience with anything that could help in this situation. He was just a mechanic. But as he looked at Irindra, her fear, her strength, he realized that he couldn't just run and hide. He couldn't let them take her. "We can't stay here," Irindra replied, her voice firm despite her weakness. "The Verkor will come. They have ships, weapons. They will find us. We must move, and we must fight." Lucas was shocked. He had never imagined that something like this could happen. An alien battle, right here on Earth. But if what Irindra said was true, they were in danger. Real danger. And there was no time to waste. Once they reached the top, Lucas turned and looked down at the woods below. From here, they had a clear view of the area. They could see the faint outline of the Verkor's ships in the distance, moving slowly through the trees. Their ships were large, sleek, and dark, designed for stealth. The enemy wasn't here yet, but they were getting closer. "They are coming," Irindra said quietly, her voice tense. She moved closer to Lucas, her eyes fixed on the ships below. "They will land soon. We have to stay hidden." Lucas nodded. They had to stay calm. He couldn't let himself panic. He had no idea what kind of weapons these aliens had, but from what Irindra had told him, they were far more advanced than anything Earth had. He glanced over at her, trying to make sense of everything. She had told him she was a defector, someone who had escaped their control. But why had she chosen Earth? Why come here? Irindra seemed to sense his thoughts. She looked over at him, her silver-gray eyes serious. "The Verkor are not just conquerors," she said. "They destroy anything that doesn't serve them. I was part of their army once, but I refused to follow their orders. I didn't want to kill, to destroy. So I left." Lucas listened, his eyes widening with understanding. The Verkor weren't just some rogue alien invaders. They were an empire, and Irindra had betrayed them. That's why they were after her. She had betrayed everything they stood for, and now they wanted her dead. "I didn't know," Lucas said softly, his voice filled with regret. "I didn't know you were running from all of that." Irindra gave him a small, tired smile. "You didn't need to know. All that matters is that you are helping me now." Lucas felt a rush of emotion. He wasn't sure why, but he knew he couldn't turn his back on her. Despite everything, despite how impossible the situation was, he had made a promise to her. He would protect her, no matter what. Suddenly, the sound of engines grew louder, and Lucas's thoughts were interrupted. He turned back toward the ships. They were almost here. Irindra's eyes narrowed. "They are coming down," she said. "Stay low. Don't make a sound." The ships were now just above the treetops, their engines making a low rumbling noise as they hovered above the forest. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The Verkor were here, and there was no turning back now. He and Irindra crouched low, hiding behind the large rocks that surrounded the outcrop. They could see the ships descending, their dark silhouettes moving silently through the trees. The Verkor had arrived. Lucas held his breath, trying to stay as still as possible. He glanced over at Irindra. Her eyes were focused, scanning the area below for any signs of movement. She looked so calm, so in control, even though the situation was anything but. "We need to make it to the other side of the hill," Irindra whispered. "When they land, we move. Quickly." Lucas nodded. They had a plan, But now it was up to them to make it work. The Verkor were dangerous, and they weren't going to give up easily. But if they had any chance of surviving this, they had to stay ahead of them. The hunt had begun. Lucas stayed as still as possible, his back pressed against the cold rock, his breath shallow. The Verkor ships hovered just above the treetops, their dark shapes barely visible against the early morning sky. The hum of their engines was a constant reminder of how close they were, how close danger was. Lucas felt the weight of the moment, the pressure of knowing they couldn't afford a single mistake. Herindra was beside him, her eyes fixed on the ships below. She was calm, calculating. Every movement she made seemed purposeful, as if she had done this kind of thing hundreds of times before. Lucas, on the other hand, was trying to keep his thoughts from spiraling. He was scared, but he couldn't let that show. He couldn't let Herindra see his fear. She was depending on him, even if she didn't say it out loud. The ships were now just a few 100 feet away, their engines slowing as they descended toward the forest floor. Lucas held his breath. They were so close. He could hear the faint crunch of leaves beneath their massive metallic legs. He glanced at Herindra, who gave him a sharp, quiet nod. It was time to move. Without a word, they both slipped out from behind the rock and crouched low to the ground, staying in the shadows as much as possible. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and masking their movements. Lucas tried not to look at the ships. He kept his focus on the path ahead, knowing that even the smallest noise could give them away. They moved quickly, their feet barely making a sound on the soft earth. Herindra led the way, her senses sharper than Lucas's, guiding him through the thick trees and underbrush. They had to move fast. The Verkor were trained hunters, and it wouldn't take them long to start searching the area. They had to stay ahead of them, out of sight. As they crept through the woods, Lucas's mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about what Herindra had told him. The Verkor weren't just hunters. They were a ruthless military force that had conquered entire worlds. They had ships, weapons, and technology far beyond anything Earth had. And they were coming for her. For them. Lucas's chest tightened as the reality of the situation sank in. He wasn't just protecting an alien fugitive anymore. He was protecting Earth itself. If the Verkor succeeded in capturing Herindra, who knew what would happen? Would they come after Earth next? He pushed the thoughts aside. They couldn't afford to think too far ahead. They had to focus on the here and now, getting out of the woods, staying alive. They reached the edge of the forest, where the trees began to thin out. Lucas could see a clearing up ahead. There was a small creek running through it, and beyond that, a rocky hill that led to higher ground. It was their best chance for escape. Herindra turned to him, her face serious. "We make a run for it. As soon as we reach the creek, we move fast. We can't let them see us." Lucas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew the plan. They just had to execute it without making a mistake. One slip, one misstep, and they would be caught. As they started toward the creek, Lucas heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the unmistakable noise of a ship's engine, closer, much closer than before. The Verkor were coming, and they were coming fast. "Move," Herindra hissed, grabbing his arm and pulling him forward. They ran, their feet pounding against the ground as they crossed the clearing. The creek was just ahead, but the sound of the engines was growing louder. They didn't have much time. Just as they reached the creek, Lucas glanced over his shoulder. The first Verkor ship was descending, its massive shadow sweeping over the trees. It was too late to hide now. They had to keep moving. Herindra didn't hesitate. She dove into the creek, her movements swift and graceful. Lucas followed closely behind, jumping into the cold water with a splash. The current was stronger than he expected, pulling at his legs as he struggled to keep his footing. Herindra was already ahead of him, using the rocks in the creek to climb up the opposite bank. Lucas gritted his teeth and pushed forward, his eyes fixed on Herindra as she scrambled up the rocky slope. His heart raced. They were so close, but the ships were coming. He could hear them now, the whirring sound of the Vercor ships above them. They were getting closer by the second. He reached the top of the creek's bank and looked around. There was a narrow path leading into a dense thicket of trees. Erindra had already taken the lead, slipping between the trees like a shadow. Lucas followed her, pushing through the underbrush. His mind was racing, his body on high alert. He could hear the ships moving overhead, but he didn't dare look up. They had to stay out of sight. For what felt like hours, they moved through the dense forest, staying low and quiet. The Vercor ships passed overhead several times, their searchlights scanning the area. Lucas held his breath each time, hoping they wouldn't spot them. But somehow, they managed to stay out of sight, moving farther into the woods with each passing minute. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the edge of the forest. In front of them was a small, abandoned cabin, hidden away from the main road. Erindra stopped and turned to Lucas, her silver-gray eyes searching his face. "We're not safe yet," she said quietly, "but we can rest here. For now." Lucas nodded, his body aching from the constant movement. He was exhausted, but he knew that they couldn't let their guard down. Not yet. They were still being hunted, and the Vercor wouldn't give up easily. Erindra led the way into the cabin, and Lucas followed, closing the door quietly behind him. The small space smelled of old wood and dust, but it was shelter. It was a temporary refuge. As Lucas leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of relief. They had made it through the worst of it, for now, but the Vercor were still out there, and they were getting closer. The cabin was small, dimly lit, and still. The walls, once painted in a faded shade of blue, had peeled over the years, revealing the raw wood beneath. A few broken windows let in the faint light of the early morning, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Lucas collapsed on an old wooden chair near the corner, breathing heavily. His heart was still racing, the adrenaline pumping through his veins as the image of the Vercor ships hovered in his mind. They had made it out of the woods, but only by the skin of their teeth. It had been close, too close. Erindra stood by the window, her sharp eyes scanning the area outside. Her stance alert as always. Despite the apparent exhaustion, she was focused, unwilling to let her guard down for even a second. "We should move," she said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but urgent. She didn't speak like someone who had just escaped an enemy fleet. She spoke like someone who had been through worse. Lucas looked up from the chair. "What do you mean? Move? We just got here. We need to rest, at least for a little while." He rubbed his face, trying to wipe away the exhaustion. Erindra turned toward him, her eyes softening for just a moment. "If we stay here too long, they will find us," she said quietly. "I know their tactics. They won't stop searching." Lucas let out a deep sigh. He didn't want to leave the safety of the cabin, but he knew she was right. They had to keep moving. The Vercor were ruthless, and if they stayed in one place for too long, they would be cornered. He had to be strong for Erindra. He wasn't just her protector anymore. He was her partner in survival. He stood up, stretching his stiff muscles. "All right, we'll move." Erindra didn't waste any time. She immediately began gathering a few supplies from the cabin, mostly old tools, food, and anything that could be useful. Lucas helped where he could, his mind still clouded by the events of the past hours. He kept thinking about what she had told him. The Vercor weren't just hunting her. They were hunting them both now. And as long as he stayed with her, he was a target too. "Where are we going?" Lucas asked, his voice a little rough from exhaustion. Erindra glanced back at him. "There is a place, a hidden camp. It's deep in the forest. The Vercor won't think to look there." Lucas nodded. He didn't care where they went as long as it was far from the Vercor, as long as it gave them time to think and figure out their next move. He could hear the hum of the Vercor ships in the distance, though it was faint. They were still out there, still searching. "Let's go," Lucas said, moving toward the door. He couldn't let himself think about the danger. If he did, he'd freeze. He couldn't afford that. Not now. They stepped outside into the cool morning air, the light of dawn slowly breaking through the trees. The forest was still and peaceful, but Lucas knew better than to be fooled by it. The Verkor were out there, and the peacefulness of the woods didn't mean safety. It meant silence before the storm. Erindra led the way, her steps light and sure, moving with a kind of grace that made her seem like part of the forest itself. Lucas tried to keep up, but he was beginning to feel the toll of the past hours. His legs were sore, his body was tired, but he pushed through. There was no time to rest. As they moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the Verkor ships faded away, replaced by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. For a brief moment, it almost felt normal again. Almost. "You've been running for a long time, haven't you?" Lucas asked, his voice soft. He glanced at Erindra's back as she moved ahead of him. Erindra didn't answer immediately. She kept walking, her eyes scanning their surroundings. Finally, she spoke. "Yes, it has been years. But I have always been hunted, always been alone." Lucas frowned. He wanted to say something comforting, but he didn't know what. What could he say to someone who had been running for years, constantly hunted by an alien race? He had no idea how she'd managed to survive for so long. "I didn't ask for this," she continued, her voice soft but firm. "But I won't let them take me. Not again." Lucas felt a surge of admiration for her. Despite everything she had been through, despite the constant fear and danger, Erindra was still fighting. She was still determined to survive. He could see it in her eyes, in the way she moved. She wasn't just trying to escape. She was trying to win. And that meant he had to help her. They continued walking for another hour, moving in silence. Lucas's mind was spinning. He was still struggling to understand what was happening, to wrap his head around the fact that an alien army was hunting them both. It felt surreal, like something out of a movie. But it wasn't a movie. It was real. As they reached a small clearing, Erindra stopped and turned to him. "We'll rest here for a moment," she said, her voice more relaxed now. But only for a moment. Lucas nodded and sank down onto a fallen log. His legs were shaking, and his body felt like it had been through a marathon. He needed a break, but he knew it wouldn't last. They had to keep moving. Erindra sat down beside him, her expression thoughtful. She didn't speak for a while, just watched the forest around them. It was peaceful here, but the silence felt heavy, as if the world was holding its breath. "You're different," Erindra said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Most people would have run, but you stayed." Lucas looked at her, surprised. "Why would I run?" he asked. "You didn't ask for this, and neither did I. I'm not just going to let you face this alone." For a moment, Erindra seemed to study him, as if weighing his words. Then she gave him a small smile, her silver gray eyes softening. "I didn't think you would say that, but I am glad you did." They sat in silence for a moment longer before Erindra stood up and motioned for Lucas to follow her. "We go now. The Verkor are getting closer. We cannot waste any more time." Lucas stood up with a sigh, stretching his stiff muscles. He was tired, but he had no choice. They couldn't stop. Not yet. They were still being hunted, and the chase was far from over. The day had barely begun, but the forest already felt alive with tension. The birds were quiet, and even the wind seemed to have slowed down, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Erindra and Lucas moved through the dense woods, their every step calculated, their senses on high alert. The Verkor were getting closer, and there was no time left to waste. They had to make their stand, or they would be caught. Erindra had led them to a high cliff that overlooked the valley below. From here, they could see for miles. An advantage, but also a risk. The Verkor ships could spot them from this vantage point. But it was too late to turn back. This was the only place where they might have a chance. Lucas adjusted his backpack, trying to steady his nerves. He had never been in a situation like this before, never had to fight for his life. But as he looked at Irindra, he knew he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when they had come this far. "This is it, isn't it?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with determination. He could see the faint outline of the Vercor ships in the distance. They were coming. Fast. Irindra nodded, her expression grim. "It is. This is where we make our final stand. We fight, or we die trying." Lucas swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. He had no military training, no combat experience. He was just a mechanic, a man who had been thrown into a fight he never asked for. But he had learned one thing in the past few days. Irindra had survived for so long because she was strong, resourceful, and fearless. If she thought this was their only chance, then it was. And if she was ready to fight, so was he. They took shelter behind a large boulder at the edge of the cliff, hidden from sight, but able to see the ships below. The ships hovered silently, their engines barely making a sound as they scanned the valley. The Vercor were looking for them. They didn't know where they were yet, but it wouldn't take long for them to figure it out. "We need to make sure they don't find us," Irindra whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "When they land, we strike. We have to take down their leader. If we do that, the rest will fall." Lucas nodded. He didn't know how they would do it, but he trusted Irindra. She knew more about the Vercor than anyone else. If she said taking out the leader was the key, then he believed her. The silence between them stretched, broken only by the distant hum of the ships and the rustling of leaves in the wind. Lucas tried to steady his breathing, trying not to think about the battle that was coming. It was hard not to, though. The fear in his chest was a constant companion, and he could feel it tightening with every passing second. Suddenly, Irindra tensed, her eyes narrowing as she watched the Vercor ships below. "They're landing," she whispered urgently. "Get ready." Lucas's heart raced as he crouched lower behind the boulder. The ships were descending, their sleek forms cutting through the air with precision. The sound of their engines grew louder as they neared the ground. It was time. The Vercor were almost here. Irindra reached into her bag and pulled out two small devices. She handed one to Lucas, her expression focused. "These are disruptors. We'll use them to take out their communication systems. If we can knock out their ability to call for backup, we might have a chance." Lucas took the device, his hand shaking slightly as he examined it. It was small, but it looked powerful. He had no idea how it worked, but he trusted Irindra. She wouldn't have given it to him if it wasn't important. The Vercor ships were now just a few hundred feet away, hovering just above the ground. Lucas could see the soldiers emerging from the ships, tall, armored, and carrying weapons that looked like something straight out of a science fiction movie. They were here. They had arrived. Irindra's voice was low and urgent. "When I give the signal, we move. Take out their communication system first, then focus on the leader. We have to be fast." Lucas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so alive, so full of adrenaline. This wasn't what he had signed up for, but he had come this far, and he wasn't about to back down now. The Vercor soldiers began to spread out, searching the area. They were close now, only a few feet away from where Lucas and Irindra were hiding. Irindra's hand was on the device, ready to activate it at any moment. Lucas could feel the tension in the air, the electric charge before a storm. And then, without warning, Irindra pressed the button on the device. A high-pitched whine echoed through the valley as the disruptor powered up. For a moment, everything went silent. Then the Vercor soldiers stopped in their tracks, their eyes scanning the area, confused. They had lost contact with their ships. Now was their chance. Irindra sprang into action, moving with the speed of a predator. She grabbed Lucas's arm and pulled him toward the soldiers, her movements fluid and precise. The Vercor didn't even know what hit them. Irindra took down two soldiers in a matter of seconds, her quick strikes leaving no room for hesitation. Lucas followed her lead, unsure of what to do, but determined to help. He threw himself into the fray, using whatever he could, rocks, sticks, anything he could get his hands on, to knock down the Vercors soldiers. He wasn't a fighter, but he had to try. They made their way toward the leader, who was standing off to the side, watching the battle unfold. The Vercors leader was tall, with dark armor and a helmet that covered his face. He was calm, unfazed by the chaos around him. But when he saw Erindra moving toward him, his eyes narrowed. Erindra didn't hesitate. She charged at him with all her strength, her fists flying. The leader raised his weapon to strike, but Erindra was faster. She knocked the weapon from his hands, spinning him around and using his momentum against him. In one swift motion, she disabled him, knocking him to the ground. Lucas watched in awe as Erindra stood over the leader, her chest heaving with exertion. She had done it. They had done it. The rest of the Vercors soldiers froze, looking at their fallen leader. Without hesitation, they began to retreat, their communication systems destroyed, their morale shattered. The battle was over. Lucas couldn't believe it. They had won. Erindra turned to him, her expression a mix of relief and exhaustion. "We did it," she said quietly. "It's over." For the first time in what felt like forever, Lucas allowed himself to relax. They had survived, and they had won.